I aim to a little bit further introduce Rock River Laboratory. My understanding is that our Rock River does not provide all that much in terms of service for your team, or am I incorrect?
You are our provider.
Okay, so I need to
Yep.
I need to better understand that. So those of you working with swine, cow, calf, beef, and dairy, we would be doing your forage and feed analysis. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Well, first off, I really appreciate your business, and I'm sorry for not clearly understanding our business relationship. So I'll look then to help build upon that, along with Larry. When talking with Ray earlier, I understood that we might be doing some of your work, but not all. But glad to hear that we're there for you, or we have been there for you, and then you'll hopefully get a better understanding of what we can do heading into the future. So let's use the forum today. I'll show you a little bit more of Rock River in terms of maybe our feed scan smartphone app in the event that anybody was interested in using that to streamline sample submission. And then we'll talk a little bit about silage making, fermentation management, and where things can really come out of line. This is an area. So my background is plant breeding and genetics in dairy nutrition, rumen microbiology. Trained at the University of Wisconsin for a couple master's degrees and then PhD. Studied under Randy Shaver, Dave Combs, and then Jim Coors. I don't know if any of those names mean anything to you, but dairy nutritionists and then a plant breeder. So I've been trained in forage management, genetics, in nutrition, primarily fiber and starch things in the rumen, dairy primarily, but beef a little bit as well. But I've taken an interest in silage and making silage and preservation because of my experience. I've been out of graduate school for coming up on 9 or 10 years, and the first 4 or 5 years I was a consulting nutritionist with a feed company in the upper Midwest, providing technical support for about 100 field nutritionists and team, but then also taking care of about 5,000 head of dairy cattle as well myself. And I just saw a tremendous opportunity in better preserving feed, providing healthier, cleaner feed to cattle, and I saw what impact it had. And so I did a little bit of work as a field nutritionist, but then now that I've been with Rock River for 5 years, spent more time and effort in this area, have published a little bit of research, continue to do some research, and am networked and teamed up with some pretty good researchers and scientists, Lehman Kong and others that are doing work in this area. More recently, Luis Ferreiro down in Florida, as we really look to better understand what's happening during ensiling. And this past year with some of the mycotoxin challenges, and now we've got heavy drought out through the Dakotas, which has given us potentially some different challenges in terms of aflatoxin or maybe some other challenges in storing and preserving feed. There's a lot that can happen. So we'll get into some basics today and trust that we've got quite a bit more resources. I sent Trish a good number of articles I've written for Hordes and Progressive and Hay and Forage that you can read or you can discard. I've sent a couple benchmarks as well talking about just fermentation stuff. So with that introduction, I'll then go into a little bit of Rock River background. So we've been around for 40 years now. Don Meyer, who is our fearless president yet today, had started the business 40 years ago in his parents' garage, and now his son and daughter, Zach and Lauren, are involved in the business. And so I just rolled over 36 years on this planet. Zach is right there with me, and Lauren is about that same age as well. So we're in our mid-30s here as kind of the future and lifeblood of Rock River, but Don in his mid-60s is involved as well, and it's been a fun business to be part of because it's a family-oriented group. We've got a lot of flexibility, but yet we're really pushing forward to make a difference as well. Our aim is to make your lives easier and help you make decisions on behalf of your clients quicker so that you can move on to the next thing. There's a lot of data, a lot of information in front of us, and so sorting through that and figuring out what means something, what doesn't mean something, that's kind of the underlying goal of what we do. My dad and his two brothers, we lost my dad here shortly ago, but he was dairying with his two brothers, and they taught me that we need to be kind of making things work. There better be some tie to some research or academia or big picture idea, and it better make the cows better be in agreement. It better make some difference at the farm level. Otherwise, we really don't need to be spending any time on there. So that's really where we focus, making sure that we're in agreement with cattle. When I started with Rock River, we were in the upper Midwest here in southern Wisconsin. And then in the last 5 years, we've actually expanded our footprint greatly. Still a very small family business, but we've got a footprint that we've been able to replicate. So we have an office in northern Wisconsin, which actually, if you're not working with that office, it might be a better option as far as turnaround to service Minnesota and eastern South Dakota and maybe up into Iowa. We have UPS shipping labels that we can get next day turnaround done. So if you're not working with our northern Wisconsin office, that might be something we want to think about. I'd welcome you along with Larry or myself. We also have an office in California. That was the first expansion actually that Don and Zach went into about 5 years ago. Now we have two offices in Ohio, one in two out east in Ohio and New York. Then we have an office, partner office in Brazil, and then more recently we've opened and support two NIR labs down in Chile and Argentina. And then last year, via my network, we got connected with Chris Brandis and her team, and we have an office in Europe as well. So it's been pretty cool to experience not only more agriculture throughout the Midwest and then domestically within the U.S., but I've been down into Brazil now contributing, and more recently down into Argentina and Chile, and then likely early next year we'll be out into Europe providing tech support and nutrition there. So that's helped out. But really the principles of nutrition are the same. The opportunities, regardless of where we're at, are the same in terms of making feed and feeding healthier feed. This is my dad and brother's dairy, Gazer Dairy. It's third generation Italian and German immigrants. So I was milking cows in this little red barn here when I was a kid, chasing cattle down off this hill with my grandfather, milking in the stanchion barn, and now they're milking 1,000 head. And so this is my roots. And trust, we've got a very practical mindset as support for your team. And in that vein, my dad, as he was involved from the financial management side with his two brothers, my dad was a nutritionist for 25 years before he went back and was in partnership with his brothers over the last 20 years. And he really helped me better understand our margin focus that we need to be looking at return on investment. And yes, there are some ideas that make some sense in terms of nutrition and or management, but it's got to tie back to profitability. So I pretty closely watch futures prices in corn and beans and relate that to class 3 and class 4 milk, just so that I've got an idea of what's happening day to day. And so the next 12 months, as we look from, this is dated now by a couple weeks, but as we look out over the next year, it looks like there will be some profitability on the dairy side. I don't have a chart here on the beef side, but I do follow that to a less extent as well. Further introduction, Rock River Laboratory forage analysis. I don't know if any of you have seen this type of report, but we have a comprehensive nutrition analysis report now that is titled such. And then we also have a different report format where we are reporting quite a bit of information, including multiple time point starch digestion, which helps us understand how corn feeds in particular will react within the rumen. But I just wanted to showcase this newer low-cost NIR forage analysis in case that would be something you might want to look at in the future. It's got some fatty acid information here, and so some of the more progressive dairy farms are starting to hone in a little bit more on fatty acid nutrition, with butterfat being worth somewhere around $2.50 to $3 per pound. Hugely important to farm profitability. So we're definitely on the leading edge there and cutting edge, teamed up with Michigan State, Adam Locke, to get some of this nutritional work done. And then on the second page of the report, we have some pictures that are much more dairy friendly in terms of graphing out fiber and starch digestion in the rumen. So we could come back and look at some of this in the future if you'd like, or we could talk about it more in support, but I just wanted to at least showcase what we are doing in routine forage analysis, because this is very different from the prior 35, 40 years of Rock River, but we're moving forward in the right direction. And it can be almost overwhelming, even to me. And please jump in with any sort of questions or stop and pause me today. I'm going to move with a pretty brisk pace, but I'll gladly take a pause and address any questions. So before I get into talking about preserving feed, I will just take a moment to showcase our FeedScan app, and then just so you have some exposure to this and know that it'd be available in the future. So I've got, assuming you can still see my screen, can you see the screen of my smartphone now that I've got mirrored up here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so we have a smartphone app, and for me, it's right here on my screen. This works with Android or our iPhones. You can download it from the respective app stores. It's titled FeedScan, all one word. From an iOS standpoint, it is an iPhone only app, but or not iPhone only, but it's located in the iPhone apps. If you want to use an iPad to do this, you can. You just have to look for this in the right spot. But our team, myself, Larry, maybe to some extent, but also a colleague of mine, Nathan Hernichak, or Tabitha, that you've probably interacted with, we are all adept at helping you along with this. So I will move through this pretty quickly. We provide username and password. If you use our website at all to access your samples, it's the same username and password that you would use there. If not, we can get you these credentials, and then it's a one-time login, and then we go to this screen here. What we do with this app is it's meant to get accurate and quick information to Rock River Laboratory to accompany your feed or forage sample. We have NIR measurements available for pretty much any feed on farm now. In the last probably year or two, we figured out finally NIR measurements, low-cost nutrition measurements for commodity feeds as well. So if you ever want to check corn gluten feed, distillers, soy hulls, whatever, you know that you have a low-cost $25 NIR measurement that you can do on some of that as well, just to hone in on feedlots or on dairies. So when we use this smartphone app, there's two ways to do it. One is we can send you out a printed sheet of barcodes that you could stick on your forage sampling bag, but I prefer actually the generate work order function. So I'm going to click this generate option here, and then that gives me a unique work order ID, 47 Bravo 34 Charlie United Delta. So this would be all that I would write on the bag with my permanent marker, and then I'm going to click OK. And so the unique aspect of our smartphone app is that it saves all of your information after we go through. So for me, I'm associated with a number of different dealerships. For Sioux Nation Ag, if there were, say, several locations, those could be within here. And if you operated out of one or two of those locations, or if you had dairies that were paying for their own samples or feedlots that were paying for their own samples, they would be available here. For example, Mgmt Dairy, that's a separate account set up through Rock River. So any account that you as an individual are set up with is you have access to here. UK Coldstream Dairy, that's actually a dairy I do the consulting for, the only one, because I'm not out to compete with anybody, but just to keep me sort of fluent in animal nutrition, I do work for them. So I'm going to click UK Coldstream Dairy, and then here we've got a farm list, which if you're working with 10, 20, 50 different farms, feedlots, dairies, poultry, swine, the farm list will be saved over time. When picking up new business, for example, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to click down at the bottom here. If I needed to put a new farm in here, I could just type in farm X, and then I would click the next button, and it asks me, do I want to add this farm to the list? If I would click yes, then that farm would be there all the time in the future, and then would be listed as, let's see, then would be listed as Farm X here. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just demonstrating here, but I'm clicking now Coldstream Dairy, and then I'm going to click Next to move to the next screen, which will be where we submit the sample information. But if you ever forget to write down the work order, that's always listed at the bottom here as well. So I'm going to click Next. Then here is our feed list. It's managed very much the same way that the farm list is. So if we're repeatedly sampling, say, a corn silage pit, I would just scroll down to figure out where that corn silage is. So we're still feeding 2016 corn silage at this dairy, so it's here. By using the smartphone app, we actually can average the results of the last 3 samples with this functionality, and then we can get the result of the single forage analysis, and then it will actually show us the average of the last 3 samples on our report as well. That's kind of a cool hidden feature. If we ever want to get rid of a forage, I just swipe to the left like this, and then that allows me to delete and clean that up. So we're not feeding 2015 anymore, nor will we ever be, so I'm actually going to delete that, then that disappears to clean this up. So say I'm going to submit a corn silage sample. Yeah, question?
Yeah, John, no, just a comment. This is Larry here. One of the key things that really works really well in the field with that app John's looking at and talking about is we start feeding new corn silage, and it may not be feeding like it did last year or the year before, but we can jump back and look at what those years, what that corn silage looked like. And so with the farmer standing there with you doing that, it brings back to his mind, oh yeah, this crop is different in this way. And so, yes, we do need to make some corrections that we didn't have to do before. So I just thought I'd jump in, John, and throw that out there.
Sure, glad to hear you out there, Larry. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to continue submitting information here just again to finish this out. I'm going to click the corn silage right here. You can see then it keys it up down here on the bottom, corn silage 2016. I'm going to click next. If I needed to make sure that Larry or somebody else was going to get copied on the results, I could just type in Larry's email right here. And this will, you see my typing is not the best. We have software built in to pick up that email address and make sure the results get sent to that person as well. So if there was another consultant you were working with or you wanted the dairy to get access to the results on a one-time basis, you could do that. I'm going to click next. And then here's where we have all of the options for feed and forage analysis, NIR measurements, wet chemistry, everything that Rock River offers routinely is listed within this list. And so multiple options can be clicked off. I'm going to just choose the comprehensive nutrition analysis there, and then maybe I want wet chem minerals, so I'm going to do total minerals here as well. And then I click the submit button, and that is then sending all the information to Rock River with the barcode just written, or the work order written in Sharpie on the bag. So it took me a little bit of time, but I'll show you how quickly it could be done. So if I generate picture, just me writing down 47 Bravo 474 United Delta. All right, that's on the bag. Gazer Dairy, next. Let's see, I'm gonna do corn silage, next, skip this, click CNA, submit. So it can be done that quickly. So if that can save you some time and effort and ensure that we get the accurate information on a sample bag, maybe all of you have better handwriting than I do, but I know sometimes it can be a little bit messy. This is a way to effectively get information to Rock River and speed things up. So any questions on the smartphone app? Just one of the value-added services that we put out there, again, trying to make it so that you can spend less time interacting with us, but make it valuable time, and then move on to the next thing. So I'm going to disconnect this done now, and you see one of my colleagues is calling me. You're going to hang up on him. And then I'm just going to turn this off. All right, so let's jump back then in the next, let's just say 20, 25 minutes, and let's talk about making silage a little bit. So I like to start out as a making silage discussion, which is here now, in just thinking in terms of tons. And what the goal is in terms of chopping silage out of the field, putting it in a pit or a bunker or pile, whatever you want to call it, and then feeding it out is for every 100 ton we chop, we want to feed out as close to that 100 ton as possible. And there's shrink that happens all along the way. And I'll tell you that the best dairies are going to feed out probably 97 or 98 ton. And unfortunately, there are quite a few piles out there and quite a few farms, feedlots, or dairies that are probably only feeding out maybe 70 to 75 ton out of every 100. So if we're paying chop and store, well, put seed in the ground, fertilize, cultivation, paying to harvest, paying to truck it back to the pile on a 100-ton basis, and say it's $35 per 100 ton, that means we have $3,500 invested in that 100 ton. And if we only feed out 75 ton, all of a sudden, instead of $35 per ton silage, we've got 3,500 divided by 75 ton. All of a sudden, that silage is $47 a ton. Plus, the nutritional value of that silage is nowhere near what it started with, because we probably have some anti-nutritional factors. So that's how my mind thinks about this stuff in terms of putting it into quick economics and what makes a difference to the dairy. So how do we make sure we're feeding out as close to $35 per ton silage, or as close to 100 ton as what we chopped out of the field? That's what the focus is here, and why I've spent so much time looking at this area. Shrink can happen from harvest, so just feed blowing out of the wagon, or us not capturing all of the corn that's standing out in the field. Sometimes maybe that's a strategic move in terms of maybe we want to go and high cut corn at, say, 12 to 24 inches. Shrink happens during fermentation, and that's the major area I've focused. But then shrink also happens during feed out through either pitching feed or aerobic instability where we have yeast and mold and other things growing. So we'll talk about those areas right now. When I'm focusing on troubleshooting and where we are losing feed in making silage, it comes down to a couple things. It comes down to oxygen and it comes down to pH. And so when we chop feed off the field in the first place and we put it together in a pile, the feed can't even begin ensiling until all of the oxygen's gone. And that happens through a combination of packing, sealing it well, and then microbes that are in the feed chewing up whatever little bit of oxygen is nested within the pit. I do want to point out that water as well as silage dry matter, both of those will exclude air. So we can have, a lot of times we talk about dry matter density. Say 15 pounds dry matter density might be a goal. Some of our more aggressive managers are getting 20 pounds dry matter. Well, we should also consider the water component, because a 20-pound dry matter per cubic foot density measurement of 35% dry matter versus 45% dry matter, there's going to be less air in the 35 dry matter because there's more water than there is on the 45 dry matter crop, because there isn't as much water excluding air as well. So that's one of the newer areas that we're thinking about, and we're now starting to talk about as-fed density instead of dry matter density. But at the end of the day, whether it be during packing and then storing feed, or then in feed out, we want to keep air out at all possible costs, which then lets us keep our silage more stable and lets us keep a low pH. So I talked about preserving as close to 100 tons as possible, and how do we do that? There are two aspects of fermentation. One is an upfront fermentation, and then the other aspect is feed out stability, particularly with corn silage or high moisture corn. And creating a kind of a winning fermentation is much like driving your car. We do have to burn some fuel to stabilize and preserve feed. So what happens is we have bacteria all over the crop, and then in some cases we use a bacterial inoculant. And what these fermenting bacteria do, lactobacilli and others, they will consume some sugar and some readily digestible carbohydrate, and then they'll produce fermentation acids, lactic acid primarily, and in some cases acetic acid. Most of the time, acetic acid isn't ideal. Lactic acid is actually the more preferred fermentation acid, because that does a better job of decreasing the pH, again, which was the second thing I said that's very important. The goal with making a good silage in corn is we want to get that pH below 4 as fast as possible. The longer it takes to get our pH below 4 in the pile, whether that's due to us not having the right bacterial populations, whether it's us not doing a good job of getting all the oxygen out, or maybe the dry matter of the crop is wrong, or maybe it took too long for us to pack and put it all up. The longer it takes for us to get our pH below 4, that silage is just going to keep, or the bacteria on the silage is going to keep burning sugars day after day after day, hour after hour after hour. The best silages, after they're sealed, they can ferment in as little as 3 to 7 days. Some of the poorer silages and pits I've seen where it takes maybe 3 weeks to a month to put the feed up, it might take a month or 2 months to stabilize, to get that pH below 4. So I'll make another comparison and analogize to us driving a car. If we want to get from Sioux Falls to Minneapolis, the most efficient way to get there is, I think is it 90 that goes straight across, or 80? Go on Sioux Falls straight over to Minneapolis without any stops in between. That would be kind of like our fermentation, where we go from a neutral pH of 7 in the fresh crop, and then we produce the best fermentation as fast as possible. Say it only takes 7 days, and we get the pH below 4, and then the silage is stable. Well, if things don't go right, it might take 3 weeks for us to get that pH below 4. So that would be akin to us maybe driving from Sioux Falls, maybe up to St. Cloud, maybe we'd drive then down to Rochester, and then maybe we'd drive over to Minneapolis. So at the end of the day, we got to our destination, but we burned a hell of a lot more fuel getting from Sioux Falls to Minneapolis than we did with the first trip. So same type of things happens here in terms of upfront fermentation. We want to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. It's getting the oxygen out first, it's having the right bacteria and the right crop quality, and then getting that pH down. Then there can be something called a secondary fermentation or aerobic instability that happens, where we start burning fuel again if we don't get our pH and keep our pH low, and that's where we lose maybe another 5, 10, 15 ton out of that 100. So what happens during ensiling, just to put it in a pictorial, is I mentioned before we burn some water-soluble or readily digestible carbohydrate. That's actually glucose, fructose, or pentose, so it's plant sugars. And the fresh crop might start with corn silage or haylage. We might start with around 10% sugar in that crop. And then as soon as we get the air out, that would be day 0 here. So we've packed it all, we've covered it, now the fermentation process starts. So what happens is fermenting bacteria will consume some sugar, and then ideally they create almost an equal amount of lactic acid. And then as that lactic acid is produced, the pH of that crop drops. And like I said before, the magic spot for corn silage is around 4. For haylages or small grain silages, they've got a little bit of buffering capacity. So our goal in those crops is get to below 4.5. But we want to get down below that 4 as fast as possible. So in this picture, I've shown it takes about 10 days to 2 weeks for us to get there. So we went from 10% sugar to about 5% sugar. We went from 0% lactic acid to about 4% lactic acid. So a pretty good conversion of dry matter with pretty much very low dry matter loss. We might have only chewed up maybe 1 or 2 tons out of that 100 in this case to then get that pH below 4, and then the crop is stable as long as we keep air out. Here, there is a little bit of acetic acid that's produced during fermentation, but this acid is not as strong as lactic acid. So I look at lactic to acetic ratios as an indicator of, hey, how efficient were we in getting our pH low? That would be kind of one of the thumb rules in terms of assessing a fermentation measure, the lactic to acetic ratio. So the less acetic acid relative to lactic acid, the more efficient things were. A historic thumb rule has been kind of a 3-to-1 ratio, but some of the better fermentations with at least a lactic acid fermentation, it might be 4-to-1, 5-to-1, 6-to-1 there. So does that make some sense with this graph here as I looked at percent of dry matter or pH on the y-axis? So when things don't go right in terms of the upfront fermentation or feed out, we actually get heat produced, because during fermentation, there's always a little bit of heat produced. So the higher the temperature, the more heat that's produced. That tells me that things are also a little bit less efficient. So one thing I'll actually do from a practical standpoint is also make temperature measurements at the pit. And this might be something your team could do once we start feeding out. So if I knew that the crop was it was about 65 Fahrenheit outside when we put the crop up in, say, late August, what I can do is several weeks to months later, after they open the silo back up, I can go back and I can take temp measures on that and get an idea of how fast the forage fermented. So this would be kind of one of the practical points to look at some of this stuff. With bigger pits, say 50 foot wide or greater, or even 25 feet wide, there's such a mass of water and feed there that the temperature will be pretty much retained at the temp it was when we chopped the feed. With silo bags or upright silos, that's not necessarily the case, because hotter temps outside or when we get below freezing, those will kind of heat up or cool down smaller bags or silos. But with bigger pits and piles, this temperature measurement's a great tool for me. So the best fermentations will raise about 10 degrees in temperature, and then will kind of stabilize back to the temp outside it was when we chopped. But when things go to hell in a handbasket, we might have a 20 or even a 50 degree increase in temperature, which to me represents, hey, we drove way too far in trying to get from point A to point B. So this is an indicator of excessive tonnage losses by just using temperature and creating heat. We didn't create fermentation acids. We were just spinning our wheels, burning fuel, and we just didn't get where we needed to be. So temperature can be a really good practical tool, and know that your starting point is about the temp it was outside when we chopped the feed. So this week, mid 50s, or not mid 50s, mid 70s to maybe mid 80s. We don't want to be probably much more than 95 degrees, 90, 95 in our silo ever. All right, so transitioning on, we're talking about upfront fermentation. So what if things don't go well in the first, say, week to 2 weeks? And again, jump in here with any questions, please, or discussion, because I'm moving at a pretty brief pace. But if we don't do a good job, the oxygen's not excluded, or we don't have the right bacteria, or maybe the crop's not dry enough, or maybe the crop isn't high enough quality, who knows what. Well, in that type of situation, we can have an extended fermentation, maybe one that never even gets to stability. Here I've depicted, maybe there's some air in this silo. The bacteria have actually continued to consume fuel to the point where there's none left, and it took 3 to 4 weeks to get our silage pH anywhere around that 4. During that time, we did have some lactic acid produced, but because there was air in the system, some other bacteria were probably growing, and we also had acetic acid produced with lactic acid. So instead of having things stable by this point in time, we continued to drive and drive and drive and drive for another 2 weeks here, and we burned up a lot more fuel here, probably 4, 5, 6% of the crop sugar, which might represent 4 to 6 ton of feed, or even 8 to 10 ton of feed over this 2-week period of time that just disappeared. It was turned into maybe some alcohols, because we can produce ethanol, but then also a number of alcohols during ensiling, much like would be the case with distillation or in a ethanol plant. I know there are quite a few of those out your team's way. We'll create ammonia nitrogen, and then we'll create a bunch of gas also, hydrogen, CO2. And so here's where we lose a heck of a lot of tons during ensiling when things don't go as well as they could have. And again, this can be due to multiple reasons: oxygen, not the right bacteria on the crop, maybe some other factors, crop quality, maybe it's too dry, who knows what. So there, in this case, we've lost a lot of tons during this phase here. We've got it packed, we got it covered, but we just really didn't do a good job ensiling. We lost 6 to 10 ton during ensiling. Then during feed out would be another area where that we could lose 6 to 10 ton when the crop is opened back up, because when we open the crop back up to feed it, obviously it's going to be exposed to oxygen. That's just what happens. So there can be a stable crop that can endure being exposed back to oxygen if it's got a low pH and it's packed really well, and we feed it out aggressively, say 1 to 3 feet feed out per day. Or if we only feed, say, 1 or 2 inches off the silo a day, air can get in 3 feet into the face of a well-packed bunker. In terms of a bag, air can probably get 6 feet back in a bag, or maybe 9. And so if the pH isn't low, or if there's a heavy amount of yeast, then maybe we can start to have some challenges in feed out. So what happens during feed out challenges, again, to differentiate from, I was talking about fermentation losses on the front end, but on the back end when we're feeding things out, if our silo went through this type of fermentation where it took us forever to get this pH down, maybe it didn't get as low as it needed to be, and then when we open the feed back up, so say this might be, like 4 months later, if the pH isn't low enough or there's a lot of yeast will actually, pH keeps bad bacteria from growing, and keeping the oxygen out keeps yeast from growing. So those are kind of two of the factors that are at play. Yeast and negative bacteria are sort of the two enemies in terms of storing feed. When we open the feed back up, yeast can grow at lower pHs, and that's why that defacer or just aggressively feeding out are so important, because we do have a pretty heavy amount of yeast in the upper Midwest just because of the environment. And what happens when yeast are present and air is let back in the silo is yeast can grow even at lower pHs, and what they'll actually do is both break down sugar, but then they can also utilize lactic acid as a food source. And so they'll actually consume some lactic acid in the first hours to days, and they'll actually then create a less acidic environment, and then the pH will actually start to rise with aerobic instability and feed out challenges. And then once the pH rises, then mold and other negative bacteria can start growing. So we kind of have a number of things happening together, and forgive me, the analogy is escaping me as how I describe this, but it starts with yeast, and then bacteria and yeast and mold start coming on if we don't have stable feed at feed out. So here's actually, though, acetic acid will inhibit yeast growth. And then there is a Lactobacillus buchneri inoculant, and then there's some other feed preservatives like sorbates and benzoates that can be applied to feed as a preservative strategy. Those are also active at keeping yeast from growing. And so those can be strategies to keep feed more stable at feed out. So under this situation, this is where we lose maybe another 6 to 10 ton out of that 100. And this is really a big challenge. This is one we're dealing and fighting pretty heavily through this time of year with the warmer temps, humidity, and these wild yeast and bacteria can not only degrade the feed, but then when they're present in the feed, it kind of gets dirty, and then we get these in the rumen of cow-calf or in dairy cattle, and it can disrupt nutrient digestion. It can mess with butterfat potentially. It can create some sick animals. So not only have we lost another 6 or 10 ton out of that first 100, but we can also have feed health challenges, and I'm dealing quite a bit with that right now in terms of fungal and bacterial contamination, and just getting a number of weird accounts from dairies that are really troubling. So I've been talking about shrink in terms of out of every 100 ton we chop out of a field, how many are we feeding out? But if that is a little bit too abstract in terms of working with a feedlot or a dairy manager, another way to think about it would be shrink in terms of bushels per ton of silage. And so one dairy I worked with in particular, we were talking about shrinking his silage, and he said, "Oh, I have plenty of feed. Just feed more corn and we feed more silage. We have plenty of carryover." And so I couldn't necessarily talk to him about, hey, we're only feeding out 75 ton out of every 100 we chop. He's like, I got plenty of feed. So I put it in a different way, and I said, all right, so if we have 3 or 6% shrink beyond maybe what's ideal in a ton of silage, that equates to a half bushel of corn. And then that was a different way for me to speak with this manager and say, all right, fine, we have plenty of feed, but you could have sold another half bushel of corn for every one of the 14,000 ton of silage we have sitting there. And then he kind of did the math in his head and said, oh, all right, so maybe I would have had 7,000 bushel of corn that I could have sold at $3.50. That's just maybe another way to think about and talk about some of this stuff. If that helps you at all in your day-to-day, feel free to run with that analogy. And what this is when we have shrink, again, it is carbohydrate losses. It's not ash, it's not lignin, it's not fiber that's getting broken down in silage, but it's high quality carbohydrate. So that needs to be replaced with basically corn or sugar. So that's why I say a half bushel of corn. Okay, so in terms of if we have feed out challenges, and I've sort of alluded to this, we want to limit any opportunity oxygen has to get in the silo. So keeping a clean face, maintaining our density, only cutting enough plastic back for maybe 2 or 3 days of feed out, whether if it's a bag or a pit silo or a bunker silo. I mentioned a Lactobacillus buchneri type inoculant. That will actually strategically produce a little bit of acetic acid. So we do give up a little bit in terms of dry matter losses on the front end of fermentation, but it produces that acetic acid, which inhibits yeast and mold. There's great research showing that we can keep feed clean and cool for hundreds of hours at feed out. I think there are probably also some antimicrobial properties that are produced by this Lactobacillus buchneri, because it's just amazing how fresh and clean feed stays with a buchneri inoculant. And we can combine a buchneri with other fermenting bacteria to kind of have a good upfront fermentation as well as good feed out stability. But a Lactobacillus buchneri inoculant grows pretty slowly. So if we're putting up corn that we're going to have to feed, or silage that we're going to have to feed pretty aggressively pretty soon, I'm not going to put a buchneri inoculant on, say, maybe the last 20 or 30 feet of that bunker or bag, because we aren't going to be recognizing the benefit. And typically these cost maybe 50 cents to $1 per ton more than a regular inoculant. But that's one strategy. Then I mentioned sorbates, benzoates, some other acid and preservative type compounds that can be put directly on feed and bypass the bacterial fermentation. That can be another strategy as well, but that one tends to be a little bit more costly because we end up putting 1, 2, 3, 4 pounds per ton of either an acid or a different product on, and that can sometimes cost $3 to $5. Whereas a bacterial inoculant at, say, 50 cents to $1.50 per ton can kind of do the same thing. In terms of managing a feed out then and limiting yeast impact on the TMR, or at the feed bunk, will often managers will see deteriorated or spoiled feed along the top of a bunker or a pile or a bag, and they'll pitch that off. But what I've learned through using infrared cameras and other ways where I can see heating and actual deterioration is the black feed that you see here on the top of this silo. That's actually stable feed again, and it's broken down, much like kind of the white ash that's left in the fire pit after you get through and burn the fire. But then there's active heating like in an area that might be 50% greater, if you can follow my scribbling here. Maybe down in this zone here, if you use an infrared camera, you can actually see heating going on in this area, and that's where the yeast and mold are actually now growing, whereas the black on top, that's cool again to the eye or to the touch. So what I recommend is to discard more than what's been visibly deteriorated. So here we see maybe 4 inches that's deteriorated on top. I might go in and I might tell this dairy, hey, let's get rid of this area so we don't bring that yeast and mold into our TMR and into the rumen of the cattle, where we create even further challenges. I do have fermentation analysis goals. Here, our guidelines is greater than or less than 4 pH, greater than 3.5 lactic acid, less than 2 acetic acid. I sent these to Trish, so you'll have copies of these for grasses or halages, grass silages, halages. A little bit different benchmarks there. I mentioned that pH below 4.5, and then I've referenced some research on these benchmarks as well. High moisture corn, some benchmarks there, but I'm just going to skip through these. In terms of yeast and mold, and I'm just wrapping up here, for me, the range between 0 and 100% spoilage is, we measure yeast and mold counts, and we measure these in colony forming units. So this would effectively be like 1 bacterial colony or 1 million bacterial colonies per gram of forage. It's crazy to think about a gram, which is basically like a teaspoon of forage, but there can be millions of bacterial colonies in that. So I want to see less than 1,000 CFUs per gram for high quality feed, clean feed. But when we get to 100,000 and up to 1 million, that's where we go from 10% to 100% spoiled feed. And then if we see 10 to 20 or 30 million, I mean, that feed is just drunk with these little nasties. We do also measure fermentation shrink through a meta-analysis equation I published. If you care about that, I can provide some reference around that. But we do have something on our forage reports that on our comprehensive nutrition analysis where we do report out fermentation shrink or an estimate of that, the losses. So that might be a management tool. And then I did also create this slide looking at silage density, which I referenced before. Here's what I was talking about. If we harvested silage at $46 per ton, but we didn't get it packed as well, we might have had these losses based on research. We might have gone from losing 7.5 ton per 100 to maybe we lost upwards of 20 ton. And so you can see as we've done that, now we're feeding out $54 per ton silage instead of $46 per ton silage, just because some of that shrunk is, and that's benchmarked here against 22 pounds density versus 13 pound density. So you'll have this slide set. I'm recording it, and I can also provide just a PDF of this in follow-up so you can reference back against this if you'd like. And I welcome you following up with me after the fact as well. So wrapping up, in terms of limiting dry matter losses, keeping clean feed, and again, this is a very complex topic which we're flying through here today in 20-30 minutes, but it starts with harvesting a high quality crop and avoiding rain, in particular with haylage crops. But the high quality crop comes into play in having enough sugar to ensure that the bacteria can do a ferment and create some fermentation acids. Chopping at the right moisture is critical because it both excludes oxygen and then lets us to pack it a little bit better. Things really go bad when it gets too dry, particularly with corn and making corn silage. I mean, for me, the ideal dry matter in a bag or a silo is 35%, 65 moisture. So starting a little bit wetter than that, ending a little drier, but ending up with 35. I like to see the influential people on farm at either the pack tractor or the silo or the bagger so that they can see the crop coming in. Are we getting the kernel processing score? Are we getting the dry matter right? Are we not? Anything that doesn't look right, this person needs to have ability to make key decisions and stop us in the event that things aren't right. And then I'm a huge fan of using a research-proven inoculant. There are a lot of inoculants out there. There's no oversight body, but there's a lot of research done by some more reputable companies. So Rock River doesn't have any dog in this or any horse in this race. to analogize, but I think inoculants should be put on every crop just to feed out as many ton as possible. And then as I started off the conversation today, I talked about oxygen, keep it out, and getting the pH below 5 as fast as possible and getting it to that 4 to 4.5 mark, depending on the crop. So those are kind of my key take-home points. And here's an example of how I've used temperature in the past, but I'll skip past that. So this is me. I enjoy coming out to South Dakota, and I'll be out in December at the latest this year again with one of my buddies. He works with DeKalb and Asgrow in central South Dakota. But you guys have my contact information. I welcome further questions and being here in support of your team out into the future. Here's one example of where we've got some expertise or where we could potentially help you out in terms of assessing, how did this silage ferment? Maybe we can do some measurements or analyses so that you can then take it back. But appreciate the opportunity, Larry, getting me involved, and then in collaboration with Ray and Trish. So I'll toss out to any questions. I got maybe just a couple minutes here, and then I'm going to have to cut loose.